This news is funded by viewers like you. Please support our work at democracynow.org/give. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We end today's show in South Africa, where the African National Congress has lost its majority for the first time in 30 years. The ANC, once led by Nelson Mandela, had held outright power since the end of apartheid. In last week's election, the ANC won just 40% of the vote, obtaining 159 seats in the 400-seat parliament. This is ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula.
While the ANC has won the most votes in this election, the results show a significant decline in the ANC support from previous elections. While there are several factors that have contributed to the decline in support, the results send a clear message to the ANC. We wish to assure the people of South Africa that we have heard them. We have heard their concerns, their frustrations, and their dissatisfaction.
And this is South African President Cyril Ramaphosa.
The final announcement of the 2024 national and provincial election results today in many ways represents a victory for our democracy as South Africans. It also represents a victory of our constitutional order, but more importantly, it represents a victory for all the people of South Africa. We have held another successful election that has been free, fair, credible, and peaceful.
For more, we're joined by two guests in South Africa. In Johannesburg, Trevor Ngwane is with us, Soweto-based activist, chair of the United Front, an umbrella body of community and labor organizations. And in Cape Town, we're joined by Louis Freedberg, born and raised in South Africa, veteran journalist who reported on the 1994 elections 30 years ago when Nelson Mandela was elected president. He also covered the anti-apartheid movement and transition to democracy, where he's reporting for The Nation. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Trevor Ngwane, let's begin with you. Can you talk about why you think the ANC lost its majority? Certainly has well more, a plurality of the votes, but the significance of losing the majority for the first time in 30 years.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Basically, the ANC failed to fulfill the promises of national liberation. It fell too short of the expectations of the masses, of the working class and the poor. Remember, there were great sacrifices made during the struggle against apartheid, but now the victory of apartheid has not yielded the expected results. Indeed, I would say that there's a crisis of everyday life for ordinary people, especially the poor, the working class. A comfortable life is not ordinary in South Africa. Life is difficult, it's even dangerous. Transport, there's not adequate transport, housing, a lot of homelessness, shacks, shanty towns. The unemployment is above around about 50%. Skyrocketing food prices, cost of living, crime. You know, we've got a problem of gender-based violence, women getting raped, child molestation, domestic violence. So all the poverty, the unemployment, the inequality is basically leading to a breakdown of the social fabric. And lastly, Michelle, there's been a generalized energy crisis where we have rolling power failures almost on a daily basis. And this affects all classes, including big business. So everyone is really fed up with the ANC. Everyone feels that the ANC has failed, especially because its top leadership has been mired in corruption, what is called state capture here, where government contracts are given to comrades, to friends, and people are engaged in self-enrichment. The ANC has failed. It deserves what it got.
I want to bring Louis Freedberg into this conversation. You covered Nelson Mandela being elected president 30 years ago, head of the ANC. Can you talk about the trajectory of the ANC and elaborate on what Trevor has just said?
Well, everything Trevor Ngwane said was correct. I watched Nelson Mandela vote from a few feet away in April 1994. The ANC was promising a better life for all. That was their slogan, a better life for all. We all had great hopes for the ANC, and they failed on so many fronts. And I think one of the things that's most upsetting to me when I've gone around the country, talking to young people, half the country, half of the population is under 30. And this is the key, this is South Africa's future. And talking to young people who are out of work, struggling just to survive, even ones who are in universities, figuring out how to pay their fees, how to pay their rent, they've lost faith in government. And they actually don't believe that anything will get better. And I think that's a huge challenge for the ANC and whatever coalition is cobbled together. The election last week was just really the first phase, because now the ANC has to form a coalition that's never done that before. They've been able to rule without having to consult with anybody else. And the big question now is who's going to be in that coalition? Because one of the main reasons the ANC lost so much support was because of defections from the ANC itself. The former corrupt president, Jacob Zuma, formed his own party. The party is just a shell on paper. He has the majority in at least the most votes in the KwaZulu-Natal, the second most populous state, province. And how is that going to work? Is he going to be brought back into government? What about the Economic Freedom Front that is also split off from the ANC? The leader there, Julius Malema, was kicked out of the ANC 10 years ago. So the two of those parties together would give the ANC more than 50%. Or are they going to go to the Democratic Alliance, which is a more centrist, some people call it right of center, I call it more liberal, free market party, but the leadership is dominated by whites, has really not reached into the Black community in South Africa very much. Will the ANC form an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, which has been the official opposition, which many people are hoping for? And then there's another big question, is whether the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, will be able to retain his seat after this his position after this historic, really setback. I mean, it's a humiliating result for the ANC. All of this is going to have to play out in the next 2 weeks. And South Africa is really still at sort of fork in the road. Is it going to go towards a more stable government, or is it going to bring back into the party some of the corrupt elements that they tried to get rid of?
Trevor Ngwane, let's end with you. As I watched Cyril Ramaphosa speaking live yesterday, he was actually joking around, cracking jokes, though he went on to say this is a sign of a democracy and we will move forward. Who are the leaders you are looking to right now in forming that coalition government with the ANC?
Well, basically what Louis was saying, you know, our left here was decimated, and certainly forming an alliance with the right-leaning Democratic Alliance is not on. So I think that it is time now for the trade union movement, for the social movements in South Africa to get their act together, to form probably a workers' party, and to make sure that the next coming election, which is in 2 years, local government elections are important here. At least we have something cobbled together which can actually claim some of the formal political space. I'm telling you, even the number of people who voted, Amy, it went down. People didn't feel like there was any party worthy of their vote, of their trust. The ANC undermined all trust in politics, in politicians.
As we continue with part 2 of our interview about the historic election in South Africa, where the African National Congress has lost its majority after 30 years. The ANC, which has been in power since the end of apartheid, won just 40% of the vote, marking the first time the party that was once led by Nelson Mandela will not hold outright power in 30 years. We're going to turn to South African President, head of the ANC, Cyril Ramaphosa, who has now attempted to build a coalition with other parties. This was his speech, a part of it, after the official results were announced on Sunday.
The final announcement of the 2024 national and provincial election results today in many ways represents a victory for our democracy as South Africans. It also represents a victory of our constitutional order, but more importantly, it represents a victory for all the people of South Africa. We have held another successful election that has been free, fair, credible, and peaceful.
So that was Sunday. In a moment, we're going to look at what happens next. But first, we're going to go back in history to Nelson Mandela speaking at his inauguration on May 10th, 1994, after the ANC victory in that election that ended apartheid and brought Mandela to the presidency.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. We succeeded to take our last steps to freedom in conditions of relative peace. We commit ourselves to the construction of a complete, just, and lasting peace.
For more, we're continuing with our 2 guests in South Africa. In Johannesburg, Trevor Ngwane is a Soweto-based activist, chair of the United Front, an umbrella body of community and labor organizations. And in Cape Town, we're joined by Louis Freedberg, born and raised in South Africa, veteran journalist who covered Nelson Mandela back then in 1994, also covered the anti-apartheid movement and the transition to democracy, reporting now for The Nation magazine. So we're going to start with Trevor Ngwane and talk about what's happened over the last 30 years. According to some estimates, the gap between the richest and poorest South Africans is greater than it was when Nelson Mandela took office in '94. You have over 40% unemployment. Almost 2/3 of Black South Africans still live in poverty, compared to 1% of white South Africans. Can you talk about what you had to overcome by 1994, and then where the party took South Africa? ANC, I mean, the party.
Yes, when the party, the ANC, took over, it was the culmination and the victory of the anti-apartheid struggle. So the first step was to get rid of a racially based constitution, a racially based form of state, to usher in democracy where everyone could vote. That was achieved. And indeed, when Mandela was speaking in that clip you played, Amy, he talked about and marveled that the transition to democracy was peaceful. Of course, we know that there was a lot of political violence between 1990 up to 1994, the day of liberation. Nevertheless, it's true in the sense that the election on Wednesday, when the ANC lost its majority, the National Liberation Party, it was just an ordinary day in South Africa, an ordinary election. It was peaceful, it was calm. So I think that is a great achievement
upon which we can build. Of course, black people in particular, workers, did not have all the basics in life, such as electricity, famous townships in black areas in South Africa, like Alexandra, next to Sandton, are called dark cities because there was no electricity. Black people, they used their labor to dig out the coal, to build the electricity pylons, but they lived in darkness. So that is one of the first things the democratic government did. It laid out electricity to about 80% of the black population. Also, housing was laid out. But of course, all these things were undermined by poor management, poor maintenance, and in particular, the fact that most of the money was still finding its way into the pockets of big capital. Because basically, what Mandela did, he was trying to square a round peg. He wanted balance, peaceful coexistence between the exploiter and the exploited. He wanted peace between those who took the land by force and those who were dispossessed. I think after 30 years, the wheels are coming off this work on. The ship is sinking. And in fact, the ANC could have done better to manage the situation, but they failed.
So, Louis Freedberg, as you continue to describe what happened over this 30 years, let's also talk about the way forward at this point. Of course, it doesn't mean the ANC is out of politics. They have a large plurality, but they do have to work now in coalition. And what parties will it be working in coalition with, and what do you see the key issues as?
Well, right now, a lot of discussions are going on. Well, I think tomorrow, there's, every day there's serious discussions to see who's going to join this coalition. I did just want to say, Amy, that the situation as described is grim in terms of the conditions in the country. But there are some major accomplishments. I mean, just even having free and fair elections, as Cyril Ramaphosa pointed out. No president in South Africa has served more than one term, as opposed to presidents for life in other parts of Africa and the world. There is a constitutional court. I went around to rallies of new parties being formed. No security police like there would have been in the old days. You can say what you want to. There's a free press. So democracy in some ways is flourishing in South Africa. But as my good friend Rich uMkhonto said, you can't eat democracy, and that is the problem. And so the issue going forward is certainly preserving the democracy, and I do think it is an accomplishment that these elections did occur peacefully and so on, and it was quite moving to travel around the country and go to polling booths and so on. This is an accomplishment, and that this has to be safeguarded. But now the challenge is, how do you undo some of the damage? How do you get the lights back on? I'll just say the last few weeks, the last 2 months, there have been no power outages in South Africa, as opposed to these major power outages called load shedding here for the last several years. Many people saw this as a sort of an electoral stunt, and that they're anticipating the lights going out, shortly. I heard people are charging up all their appliances because they really don't believe that the ANC will be able to really make a difference. So those are some of the issues as to who is going to be in the best position to undo the damage, try to build back some of these institutions that have failed, and that is the big question.
So, Trevor Ngwane, if you can talk about your group, the United Front, an umbrella body of community and labor organizations, how much support has the ANC retained among labor organizations and unions, and what are they demanding now?
So, the United Front, of which I'm the chairperson, was formed by the biggest union in South Africa, NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. Remember that NUMSA in 2013, on the back of the Marikana massacre, NUMSA broke out of the ANC, Communist Party, COSATU alliance. The Communist Party of South Africa and the biggest union federation in South Africa, COSATU, are in a formal alliance with the ruling party, forming what Antonio Gramsci called a historic bloc. So they are running the country. Unfortunately, it's at the expense of labor, because the union leaders actually basically dance to the music of the ANC. In return, they get plum ministerial positions when they retire from their unions. So you get them becoming Minister of Employment, Minister of this, Minister of that. So that alliance is at the expense not only of organized labor, but also of the poor, of the unemployed, of pensioners, because basically the alliance allows the ANC to continue failing to deliver on its promises. So when NUMSA split from the ANC, it was even called the NUMSA moment. It gave hope that the unions, at least NUMSA and those with NUMSA, would be able to form a strong left challenge and even a workers' party. However, that experiment did not succeed, because basically, although NUMSA split from the ANC, but the politics of nationalism, the politics of Stalinism still lived in the heads of the leadership. So I think that now the time has come to recalibrate our politics, to leave behind exhausted nationalism, to get rid of neocolonialism, to try and pick a bigger wedge between us and imperialism, and to come with imaginative way forward to make sure that we challenge or at least make inroads to what is basically racial capitalism. You know, South Africa is a settler colonial society. This is what is needed. Too much was taken, Amy. A lot must be returned. The land was stolen. It must be returned. The wealth was stolen. We must take back the wealth. Unfortunately, although the economic freedom fighters, although Zuma and his MK party, they mouth these slogans, I don't trust that they can do this. But I think probably the ANC has got no choice but to actually make a coalition with these parties. And then we on the left, we have to form a new political vehicle, a workers' party, a mass party, which can challenge for state power.
You mentioned Zionism, and I wanted to ask Louis Freedberg about how popular the move by South Africa was to take a genocide case against Israel to the International Court of Justice and continue to pursue this issue, demanding emergency relief, as the final decision will take quite a long time.
Well, I'd say that it has the support of the majority of South Africans, not many in the Jewish community. Some in the Jewish community, of course, supported it. I think one of the things, there was speculation that one of the reasons that the ANC took this on, which, you know, given everything else going on, what was the rationale for taking on this very high-profile case in the middle of a campaign? Was to really, boost its support in the Western Cape here amongst the Muslim community. And that didn't happen. The Muslim community stuck with the Democratic Alliance. So I'm not sure what the political fallout will be, but certainly there's support here in South Africa amongst, probably the majority of people. But I did want to say that one of the issues the ANC faces now in terms of forming a coalition is that really the only party that actually had experience in governing is, other than the ANC, is the Democratic Alliance. And I think if some alliance is formed with the Economic Freedom Front or potentially the Zuma's party, these are just parties on paper. They've had no real experience in governing, and there has been some coalitions at a local level in Johannesburg and other places, and those coalitions have been semi-disastrous. So the problem with the coalition is you have to form alliances. It's a forced marriage with people you wouldn't want to get into bed with. But this is what happens when you lose the majority. So compromises are going to have to be made. And the question is, if Cyril Ramaphosa tries to form an alliance with a Democratic Alliance, whether the forces more on the left will revolt and force him out. I do think that there's a very strong feeling in certainly amongst many progressives around the country that if this coalition is made with the Economic Freedom Front, that would be very, very problematical, and that we're going to see more of the same in terms of what's happened over the last several decades.
Let me ask Trevor Ngwane a question about MK and about Jacob Zuma. To many who, followed, of course, South African history and were part of the anti-apartheid movement, uMkhonto with Sizwe, MK was the paramilitary wing, the armed wing of the ANC. Where is it today, 30 years later?
Well, uMkhonto sees veterans, many of them, of course, got absorbed into the ANC, got jobs in the state, got jobs in the army, but some were left outside and are disgruntled. So basically, when Zuma formed uMkhonto Sizwe, it's because, as a party now, it's because his faction inside the ANC lost power to the extent that he couldn't finish his second term as president and was replaced by the President Ramaphosa. So basically, uMkhonto Sizwe is a faction of the ANC outside the ANC. Indeed, Julius Malema, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, put it quite well. He said, hey, we, EFF, were ready to have a coalition with MK, and with the ANC. We are relatives. So I think Louis is correct that there is that apprehension that these are all birds of the same feather. They're just quibbling over power inside the palace. Another important point is that actually, when people voted for MK, many of those are ANC members who were taking half a step away from their beloved ANC. So Zuma projects himself as representing the true ANC. So in a way, the struggle in South Africa is to win the masses, win as in win the baby from the milk of their love for the ANC. So I think that, although not so positively, this election did achieve that, because for the first time, the ANC no longer dominates in terms of parliamentary majority. I am sure that in the next elections, especially in 5 years national election, the ANC will fall much further, lose more, and there'll be more scope to create real alternative parties, real policies, which will challenge what we call here white monopoly capital, which will challenge imperialism. Okay, the ANC did a great thing, going to the ICJ and all, but it has not done as much as it should have done in fighting on the side, supporting the Palestinians.
Louis Freedberg, your final comment.
Yes, I just want to say, this uMkhonto with Sizwe calling the party, that's more or less a joke, because uMkhonto Sizwe does not exist anymore. This was the armed wing of the ANC that Nelson Mandela was instrumental in setting up before he was sentenced to life in prison. So taking this name is just a way to try to confuse people as to who represents whom and to try to claim the mantle of Nelson Mandela. But I just wanted to clarify that.
And of course, Jacob Zuma was the past president of South Africa as well.
He was the past president of South Africa for 9 years. And it was under his watch that there was really this corruption got completely out of control. This term state capture where outside corrupt forces just rob the treasury of funding, which is one of the reasons that the country is in such bad shape. Why this economy is growing at 0.6%. I mean, it's essentially a stagnant economy. The worst economy in terms of GDP growth on the continent, other than Equatorial Guinea and Sudan, which is in the middle of a war. This is should be one of the strongest economies on the continent. It's certainly one of the largest economies on the continent, and the fact that it is so stagnant, the economy is so stagnant, which is why so many people are out of work. The key challenge is how to get the economy going again. And I'm certainly hoping that that's the basis on which the decision will be made as to what coalition is formed in the next couple of weeks. And by the way, they have 14 days under the Constitution. And if you know anything about South African politics, maybe politics in general, to get something of this magnitude nailed down in 14 days is going to be very difficult. And we'll just see how all this plays out.
And of course, we'll continue to cover it. Louis Freedberg, veteran South African journalist, writes for The Nation here in the United States. We'll link to your articles. And Trevor Ngwane, Soweto-based activist and chair of the United Front, speaking to us from Johannesburg. Democracy Now! Is funded by viewers like you. Please give today at democracynow.org/give.